So welcome after our last break in this panel. Our next speaker is Jason Yip. Jason is a senior agile coach at Spotify in New York. Before that, he was a principal consultant at ThoughtWorks, mostly in Australia. He first encountered extreme programming in 1999. He was formerly a committer on the first open source continuous integration server, Cruise Control. Today, he will talk about business architecture project organization. At the moment, Jason is not with us. We have a message from him recorded, but he will be with us shortly after the talk to answer any of the questions you might have. Please keep writing them on Slack, and I will display them at the end. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jason Yip. I'm a senior agile coach at Spotify, and today I'm talking about using BAPO to apply structure follow strategy to your organization. So what is BAPO? BAPO is what I think is a logical approach to org design. You start with your business strategy, design your technical architecture to support that business strategy, design ways of working that support that technical architecture, and design an organizational structure that facilitates those ways of working. This isn't a purely linear process and should be iterative, but the general order of priority makes sense. However, even if that makes logical sense, this is typically not what you actually see happen in most organizations. Instead, you see kind of a backwards approach, which is also known as OPAB. The existing organizational structure drives what is available in terms of ways of working. The ways of working in turn drives how the technology is structured, and the technology determines what is allowed for business strategy. So why does this happen? I think this is pretty much because changing org structure is messy. And how is changing org structure messy? For instance, for any org structure change, it's reasonable to expect that there will also be changes in manager reporting lines. This, combined with the phenomena that people leave managers, not organizations, means that org structure changes can potentially trigger retention issues. Similarly, from a manager perspective, changing reporting lines means some of the managers will gain direct reports while others will lose them. And because this has an impact on essentially status issues, this can lead to politics and or manager retention issues. So you might think, oh, no problem. To avoid the potential retention issues, we just won't change the managers. We'll change the org structure, but we won't change the reporting lines. But this means that a manager's direct reports can end up on different teams, and then the managers can't stay on top of the context of the different teams. So if you combine this with people preferring managers who are familiar with their contexts, you end up back with retention issues. So there's really no way out. It's also reasonable to expect that an org structure change will include reallocation of responsibilities. This means some people might lose responsibilities they liked in the previous structure and gain responsibilities they don't like in the new structure. So this leads to disengagement and or retention issues. And all of this and more is why changing org structure is messy. So the conclusion might be that therefore we should avoid changing org structure unless we really have to. So let's talk about Conway's law. From Melvin E. Conway, any organization that designs a system defined broadly will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. Simply put, organization constrains architecture. Also, you can't pretend product capabilities are independent if the architecture is coupled. So product capability here is I'm just essentially breaking down the idea of a product strategy, as in I have different product capabilities that I need to do things independently with. But here I could say, hey, I have teams that are autonomous. They're labeled as such, but they can't work on different aspects of the product and product strategy without stepping on each other because the technology architecture is designed in a way that couples everything together. So it's essentially pretend, it's make-believe. So therefore, the conclusion is that architecture constrains strategy. Combined, the overall conclusion is that structure drives architecture and architecture drives strategy. So is this true? There's a problem with this logic, and this is what I kind of see wrong with it, is that you're allowing the current design constraints of your technology and organization to decide what problem to solve even if it's essentially the wrong problem. And this all seems like nonsense. Alfred D. Chandler Jr. Has a quote I like: "Unless structure follows strategy, inefficiency results." In other words, structure should not drive strategy. Structure should follow strategy. And BAPO is essentially Jan Bosch's more fleshed out expression of that phrase, structure should follow strategy. So let's break this down. Part one, the first part of BAPO, business. I tend to interpret that as being about product strategy, specifically product life cycles, and more broadly, overlapping product life cycles or overlapping S-curves. So first point is that every product follows a life cycle. Every product has some form of market development, growth, then maturity, and then decline. Every product will go through initial development. Not every product will survive initial development, so not every product makes it to growth, but every product will eventually become a commodity. With high-performing organizations, you typically see overlapping product life cycles. Here's a nice diagram of that. The idea is that when your first product goes into decline, you already have a second or third, and eventually third product, which takes over so that the aggregate growth keeps going. It's called an overlapping S-curves because it's essentially just referring to the shape of growth of the product life cycle. But this is essentially how high-performing organizations are able to maintain growth, even though they also have to respect the product life cycle. They just have more products. Okay, so the idea is that you have second and third products to replace the growth that is eventually inevitably slowed and lost for previous products. Okay, another thing is that key activities differ at each stage of the product life cycle. When you are looking at older product capabilities, the activity is really around commoditizing, which means making it more efficient to operate capabilities or to exit them entirely if they're not worthy of further investment. Somewhere in the middle, like during growth and kind of stability, you're looking at differentiation. So the key activity there to exploit existing capabilities that you already have in growth. And finally, innovation is a key activity when you're trying to identify the next product capability, the next products. So again, each stage has different emphasis. Associated with that as well, the measurement of success is different. So your KPIs are different at each stage of the product life cycle. For a commodity category of capabilities, you're looking at minimizing the total cost of ownership. When you're differentiating, you're looking at maximizing business value. And when you're innovating, because innovation is not guaranteed to work, there's a bit of a numbers game here. So you're looking at the number of experiments attempted. As a more concrete example of what this kind of activity produces, here's a simplified version of something I did to categorize product capabilities for an ad platform. The real thing is a little bit more complicated, but this gives, I think, the gist of what the idea is. A kind of a key thing that happens here as well is that you'll notice not everyone will agree about where each capability goes, and that's useful because it's a kind of detecting misalignment in product strategy and allows you to resolve it. Okay, the next part of BAPO is architecture. And architecture is about cohesion and coupling. In other words, dependencies. So the key point here is that services should align to capabilities. Architectural services should align to product capabilities, though not necessarily one-to-one. So it's okay, it's okay to have one service mapped to one capability, but it's also okay to have a capability mapped to multiple services. The issue is that you don't want your technology, your architectural service to create coupling across unrelated product capabilities, especially product capabilities that are in different stages of the product lifecycle, because then that severely inhibits your product strategy. The second point here is that dependency should be one way. Volatile things can depend on stable things. They don't have to, but let's say they can depend on stable things, but stable things should not depend on volatile things. So specifically, innovation services can depend on differentiating or commodity services, and differentiating services can depend on commodity services, but differentiating services should never depend on innovation services, and commodity services should only depend on other commodity services. They shouldn't depend on any of the other two. Okay, and then again, this is just to make sure that you don't have essentially the instability needs of an innovation service, creating problems with things that should be more stable. Okay, so having said all these things, it's not like fixing an architecture is an instantaneous affair. It's typically quite complicated, complex. So, and you don't want to play pretend. So this was back to that picture I had before of pretending that something's autonomous when it's not. The point here is not that it's instantaneous, but more that you now have a target architecture designed to be aligned to product strategy. Okay, the third part of BAPO is process, which essentially means ways of working. Again, key activities differ at each stage of the product lifecycle. So if we look at commodity, the type of ways of working really is about outsourcing, using third-party services, internal platform teams, minimizing unnecessary variation. Whereas differentiating, that's more iterative incremental development, your kind of stereotypical agile approach, maximizing valuable variation. Finally, in innovation category, you're looking at running lots of parallel experiments, or even acquisition, so acquiring another company in order to get capability. Okay, associated with this is to recognize that different people have different preferences for different ways of working. So even though we have, hey, this is the kind of ways of working that's appropriate for this product capability, given where it's at within the product lifecycle, for the individuals on those teams, they may or may not like those styles of working, which you have to acknowledge. The model I like to use for this is from Simon Wardley, the Pioneers, Settlers, Town Planners. So you can say pioneers like the innovation are associated with innovation, like those type of activities. Settlers are in differentiation, and town planners are in commodity. So it's worth understanding how individual preferences fit within each of these areas, and then you might reassign people or have them sign up for what they prefer. And as well, you may even, when you're targeting hiring for capabilities in particular stages, you actually have that as part of selection criteria when hiring. There are some people I think that have a broader preference and they can kind of switch around and they're okay. But typically I've found that you do have preferences where people, even if they could do it, they don't enjoy working in a particular style. And it's not like, if you want to create the opportunity for people to switch to things that they can engage in without feeling bad about it. Okay, definitely you don't want to change the ways of working for a product capability based on individual preferences. You want to do that based on of where it's at in the life cycle, but you do need to acknowledge, the point here is just to acknowledge that you have to take individual preferences into account. Okay, final part of BAPO is organization. So this is structure to support desired ways of working. The first key point here is to minimize staffing allocation to commodity to free up the capacity for differentiation and innovation. That's kind of the easier part. Minimize just means as low as you can get it. Between differentiation and innovation, like what percentage you allocate to each of those is really a judgment call based off of the product strategy, current business context, etc. So really can't say, hey, it's this percentage. It's really something you have to work out yourself, and adjust as you learn more. There is a degree of complication here with commodity in that if you go to internal platform teams, even though from the perspective of a customer-facing product team, I'm minimizing allocation because I'm saying, hey, I'm going to delegate the commodity capability services to an internal platform team. For the overall organization, you still have people working on commodities, just that you put them on separate teams. So that's fine. And sometimes this does mean like, hey, there's more investment. The idea here is that you're freeing up the capacity of the customer-facing product teams to be able to focus on higher leverage activity with differentiation and innovation. Also, for internal platform teams, they will themselves have commodity services capabilities that they want to delegate even outside the organization. So kind of a typical example I think of usually is AWS and GCP for like infrastructure type things, where you say, hey, we don't need to operate this internally. We can delegate that to Amazon or Google or whatever. Okay. Another part of organization is designing teams to minimize the amount of coordination required across teams. Relevant quote here is from Team Topologies. Collaboration is expensive. Unnecessary collaboration is particularly expensive, especially as it can mask or hide deficiencies in underlying platforms or capabilities. So really, this is just structuring teams to minimize how much collaboration is required. And there's not much more to say beyond just look at how the work is going to be structured so you don't have to collaborate as much. Okay, so to sum up, in terms of a step-by-step, like what are the activities you're doing with BAPO? Step one, you're categorizing product capabilities on where they are in the product lifecycle. Step two, decoupling technical architecture across categories, ensuring one-way dependencies and making appropriate technical choices. Step three, minimizing effort on commodity and deciding distribution between differentiation versus innovation based on product strategy and business context. And step four, designing teams and accounting for individual preferences. Okay, so that's roughly high level what you want to do with BAPO. And now I'll kind of go to a more of a concrete example of what I actually attempted in sort of the activities that occurred here. So my step one was creating a straw man categorization of architectural services, starting from the existing high-level architecture diagrams that we had. Step two, validated with one of the senior engineers about whether or not my categorization made sense. And step three, validating what we came up with using one-on-ones with all the product area tribe product leads. This is our equivalent of a department lead. And this led to separating product capabilities from architectural services. So the original one I did was, hey, starting from the technology roughly, and then talking to product people, then they use more product terms. So then we separate that out and then had like the two layers like that. And then finally, validating in a group session with the mission leads was essentially one leadership level up, leadership team level up. And I will note that this didn't quite work, but I'll discuss why later. But before that, let's talk about another approach that a colleague is trying. So instead of what I did, he's creating a straw man with one of the mission leads to express the overall BAPO model, and then validating in a group session with the product area tribe leads to see whether that stuff makes sense. The reason why I wanted to show both of these is just to show that there's more than one way to do it. This is kind of like rough guidelines, but really you need to modify your approach based on what kind of influence that you have, where you are in the organization, how your organization operates. So I do like the general pro tip advice to start where you are and then just expect to iterate. So there'll be some back and forth and you'll adjust the things, but you don't need to worry about getting it perfect the first round or starting at any particular point. Just start where you are, expect to iterate. The second pro tip, the thing I mentioned before, hey, why didn't it quite work for me? I think this kind of comes down to this kind of lesson that people talk about of if you give someone a fish, they eat for a day. If you teach them how to fish, they eat for a lifetime. And I think the lesson here was that sometimes it's not about teaching people how to fish, especially if you are dealing with leaders who are used to delegating the fishing to other people. You really should just provide the fish. It's kind of annoying to them or distracting to them to go through all the fishing talk, you should just provide the fish. It's like you start providing the fish, you just get to the point, and then they may ask more questions, and that's how you should follow up. But I kind of missed that there. And this is very audience specific. So depending on who you are talking to and what level they're at, that kind of decides whether you're talking about fishing before you get to the fish or just provide the fish. Okay, so concluding thoughts, I think BAPO is a useful way to frame org design by connecting product strategy, architecture, ways of working, and org structure. From a change agent perspective, you should expect to iterate. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And you should be careful that sometimes you should just provide the fish. You don't need to walk through the model every time, depending on what kind of audience you're dealing with. To learn more about this, I have some references here, more about BAPO and a newer variant called ESAO. I also have links here to some of the other references that I used, like the product lifecycle, Pioneer Settlers Town Planners, and team topologies. So that's it, and I'm curious if anyone has any questions.
Hello, we're back again in our studio with joining us Jason. Hello, Jason.
Hello.
So how are you today? And thank you for your talk.
I'm doing fine. As you can see, I'm wearing something different though than from the talk.
Yes, exactly. It's not like you wear the same thing every day.
Right.
Of course. So we have a few questions coming up after your talk. So first of all, how would you a bit more expand into explaining how would you approach in implementing BAPO?
Oh, it depends on what is meant by what would you do to implement. I try to give a couple examples of what that is, like in a broad sense. It is somewhat context specific. So if you think of this as just the general things that you should be looking at, and then how you execute it starts getting into the, what level of influence you have in the organization, how the organization is structured, about what you can approach. I do want to emphasize it's a very iterative process. So it's not like you just say, okay, I'm going to work out the product strategy, I'm going to do some architecture thing, do some process stuff in organization, and it's like one pass. There's almost no way that's going to happen. I don't even think for a smaller organization you would see that, especially for a larger organization. There's no way that'll look like that. So it's almost like you have this model, you do what you can, and then you start cycling. I don't know if that is what the person's looking for in terms of implementation, but that's sort of what comes to mind.
I see. So just start where you are
Yeah.
and just keep doing.
Yeah.
So what would you say are the biggest challenges in implementing BAPO?
There are different parts of it. One is it could be that the strategy is itself unclear. So which you'll pick up. So as you're going through capabilities and trying to categorize them and various things, you'll just notice there's a lot of conflict in terms of understanding of where things should be, which is both confusing and also kind of, it's a real confusion though. It's not, it's actually part of the situation. So it's hard to say, oh, how do we do the rest of it if we're not clear about strategy, and you go, okay, you have to resolve strategy. That makes it hard, like especially for larger organizations. I wouldn't expect things to be super clear. If it was, you wouldn't have this problem. Everything would be great, which it's not. So there's almost like you again use what you have, saying, hey, this is clear enough, and we can do some adjustment there, and then you have to accept that some things are still being worked on. But that's where the mess will be. The other aspect, I think, is sometimes people don't want to do this because there are problems. I think I mentioned this at the beginning. Like there are all these implications of when you're changing things, which is why people are reluctant to do it, and you have to somehow overcome that.
We have another follow-up to those challenges. Wouldn't you say that some of the services or features stay without owner when you change responsibilities?
Oh, in terms of, yeah, service ownership might shift as you modify org structure, and that's a big part of why big part of doing a structure change effectively, but it's also a big part of why people are reluctant to change them even though they need to. Like I can't, like all I can say is, yeah, I agree. Service ownership is critical, but don't avoid changing it just because you don't want to do it. Like if the structure is needed to change because that's what creates better strategic alignment, then you need to work on how to change your service ownership too. Presumably, like even though I say that, presumably if you did this sort of correct, it doesn't change that much often. If it does change a lot all the time, there's probably something fundamental that wasn't really done correctly.
Mm-hmm. And in what situations would you say it didn't work?
What do you mean, the BAPO thing, or?
Yes, the approach.
I think the logic makes sense. So I wouldn't say, hey, does the overall logic not make sense? I don't see how it couldn't. Like where I did talk about it not playing pretend. So if you really can't change architecture thing, don't pretend that you already have and then change the structure with a pretend architecture that doesn't exist because it's all phony. Like things are still coupled. So, and then you're effectively saying, I'm accepting that my product strategy, business strategy is constrained because I cannot manipulate the technology enough. And that's just accepting that reality. So that's where I go. So I could say, if we're saying it doesn't work if you can't do it. I don't know if that makes sense. So like if you can't actually practically in a particular point of time modify your architecture to be better aligned with the strategy you want to have, then you're not doing that strategy, and you have to just acknowledge that and then align at that. Because then at least you have something that is real that you're aligned to rather than something that's fake. The phony thing is a waste of time. It doesn't even matter if that's what you want to and should be doing, it's just you can't do it. And you have to wait until you can before you can do it that way.
Of course, you need to have a reasoning and you need to have a purpose in what you're doing and be true to that. So staying in this true field, as a Scrum Master, how would you help me to explain it to developers why it's important to do it? What's the buy-in that I can actually talk to them about?
If we're talking about at a team level thing, if we're talking Scrum Master team level type thing, like one thing I think when, like generally with Agile stuff, I think there should be or is a strong emphasis on having close contact with customers and what the business is interested in. And this is a reflection of that, as in where's the product intending to go? Where's the business intending to go? And then given that understanding, what should you be doing in response? This is just an expression of that. It's at a higher level because it's not really a team level concept here. Most of the stuff is much broader, but it's the same idea that if you said, okay, now I understand more clearly what the product direction, what the business direction is, how do I modify the technology to reflect that so that I can respond at the pace that the business product direction requires? And how do we structure ourselves and how do we modify our ways of working to better align with that? At a team level, that basic concept still holds. You don't deal with at the same scale, but it still makes sense, I think. So it's still, like you say, how at a Scrum Master level, I would say, help the team get connected with what the product and business needs are, and then encourage them to adjust everything else to reflect that. That's the basic idea.
I see. Okay, thank you. Let me just look back. Do we have any more questions coming up for us? So you're talking about changes on the different levels, right? So on the managerial level, on the company level, and the strategy. So what would you say is the most important thing in BAPO for you?
Most important thing, probably the first thing, right? Business strategy, product strategy. If you said, hey, I'm not gonna get too fancy with this, and I'm saying like I don't have to use the rest of the acronym, I'll just say the general idea of everything should follow what you are intending to do as a business or product. So everything follows product business strategy. That's clear. That should be enough. It's not enough because usually you have to break it down more. But let's say, so I would say business product strategy is the most important thing. If that's good and it's clear and everyone understands it, you should be okay. You should be able to work it out. Having said that, most of the times I find, and it does vary on the type of organization you're in, most of the time I find the architecture is the bottleneck, right? So I find it like typically easier to get clarity on product strategy than I do to clean up an architecture. That tends to take longer. And sometimes potentially more resistance there even. That might not always be the case depending on what kind of company you're in, but that seems to be the bottleneck for most places, even though I would say product strategy is more important, but it's just not, it's typically not as difficult to deal with.
Yes, I see. Thank you very much for that. You talk about some failures that might happen along the way. Is there anything we should watch out for?
Oh, let's see. I talked about some failures in terms of introducing this as well, which were like change things. So understanding your audience and how to talk about this to various groups, because this does require talking to a lot of different groups and different things. So understanding your audience type stuff and what they're interested in. There's that kind of failure. There is failure in, there's failure in the sense that you could just be wrong. So if your product strategy just ends up being wrong and you line up to it, it'll still be wrong. Like it doesn't matter that you're efficient in doing the wrong thing, you're still wrong. So like there's always that. I don't know, because that's kind of outside the scope of this model. Like if you have a bad product strategy, I'm not sure, that's a different talk. Sure. But so like this won't automatically make your product strategy effective. It doesn't. The other things I think I like, you can make mistakes on the other stuff. I don't think they're as significant. Yeah, so like I could say the main failures I think would be if you're saying, hey, well, how would this fail? Is if maybe how you come up with product strategies just doesn't, it's nonsense, doesn't really work, in which case you just line up to nonsense and it doesn't help. Or it would be a change problem, a change failure, which means you're just not, you didn't talk to enough people, you didn't involve enough people, that kind of thing.
I see. And one last question. So what would you like people to take out from your talk about BAPO? What's the most important thing you would like them to take home, to implement, maybe to try something?
I would like people to try this out, whether or not you even tell other people, just to model your own situation and understand what it looks like using this framing, because I think you'll see, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And then you'll be able to have something interesting to share with other people and hopefully move things forward. I think this model creates a way as well just to connect different groups together, so everyone feels like they're working on the same thing, which is kind of like a bonus type thing. And we're like, hey, we're not just lining things up so we're more effective at product strategy. It also brings people together because now we all feel like we're rowing in the same boat, if you will. And then everything seems to fit now. It's not like separate groups. Now we're all part of a single idea.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that's what everybody will take from your talk. And we have, do we have any more questions? So right now we don't have any more questions coming. So thank you very much for your talk. And I will invite you to join us on a Slack channel that's specially dedicated to your talk. Any questions that might arise after this talk, maybe we need some time to process what you've told us, because they're probably a brand new approach for some of us. So the questions probably arise during some time today and tomorrow. So thank you very much for your time and hope to see you soon.